Hey everyone, I just played INPUT6, and it was short, sweet, and spooky. It's an analog horror game made by one-person developer Goostronaut that sets you loose in an abandoned robotics factory in an alternate 1994 to be hunted by a murderous maid bot while you track down 5 missing remote controls before your 15 minutes is up. It's bite-sized horror done right, and it has the rare distinction of being scary enough to make me stop playing for a little while. So let's talk about it. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, this video and everything I make on the channel is now made possible by the generous people supporting me on Patreon. I actually posted a short story I wrote there a little while ago that you can read for free right now. A little spooky epilogue for the post-Halloween period. I hope you enjoy it. And if you don't want to give Patreon money, Ko-Fi is also an option. Links are in the description. If money's not an option but you still want to help the channel out, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Share the video around because YouTube sure won't, and let me know what you think down in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. Alright, let's get to it. This is INPUT6. If hunting for a bunch of random objects in a big open space while being stalked by a tall and slender figure sounds familiar, that's because it is. INPUT6 doesn't set out to reinvent the wheel. It might be 5 remote controls and a big empty factory rather than 8 pages and a deserted forest, but it's impossible not to see the comparisons between this game and the indie horror classic Slender. I never actually played Slender back in the day. It never really grabbed me, but after sinking a few hours into INPUT6, I get the appeal. Of course, Slender didn't have a 6-foot-tall maid bot chasing you through the empty halls of the Tech-Aid robotics factory. The robot, or Mayday to use its actual name, is always on the move, but only when you can't see it. Its movements might seem random, but it does have predetermined spawn points and can be avoided if you learn the signs of its presence, the little sound distortions and the visual breakdowns. It's not just hounding you the whole 15 minutes of every game. It can lose you in the hallways for long stretches of time if you manage to slip free of its area of interest. But no matter how careful you are, it will eventually find you. And you'll always know it has, because the second it goes in for the kill, you won't be able to look away. Either your gaze will be locked in place, staring up at the thing in awe, or you'll be trapped looking straight ahead as it runs you down from the other end of a hallway, or from 5 feet away depending on luck of the draw. Most of the time the game does a good job of moving Mayday in ways that make sense, but there are definitely moments where it'll teleport behind you nothing personnel kid despite the fact there's no room, or you were looking at the only doorway in and out of the area when it moved past you. It's not a big problem. The game deals in brain-breaking geometry in other ways anyway, but it's certainly noticeable, especially on challenge mode, where Mayday's aggression is bumped up to max. Even on classic, the intended difficulty, she can find you within moments of starting the game, and once she does, your only escape is to switch inputs. You're not playing as a single character, you're actually playing as 5, each locked away in their own section of the facility, and each with their own remote control to find. Each area of the factory is roughly the same size, but they've all got different layouts. INPUT2 is the admin area with cubicle farms and executive offices. INPUT4 includes the Mayday manual printing press, along with the laundry where the robot outfits are made. And INPUT6? Well, we'll get to INPUT6. Huh, that's weird. It's generally difficult to mistake one area of the factory for another unless you're wandering down some random corridor. They've each got enough personality to stand out, but it is very easy to get lost in the inputs individually, I suspect by design. Very few rooms have only one exit. Hallways and corridors loop over each other, and the VHS tape fuzz layered across the gameplay makes it incredibly easy to get turned around on your own. And that's all before you get into the rooms that actively do give you the runaround. There are some areas of the factory that I've only ever seen once or twice in 4 hours of total game time because they're buried so deep in the maze-like level design that I only ever find my way to them by accident. Combine the confusing layout of each area with the lack of any inbuilt map option, and constantly having to switch inputs every time Mayday catches you, and you might as well be fumbling around in the dark. Whenever Mayday does find you, it might be 1 or 2 minutes before you're able to jump back to that part of the factory. You could always try to switch back quickly to keep the mental map of the area fresh in your mind, but the game will punish you for it if you do. Change inputs too quickly and you'll be hit with a hefty time penalty while the tape resets. Though sometimes it won't give you a choice if Mayday's already waiting for you on the other side of a switch. Getting caught by Mayday also hits you with a time penalty, but only for that specific input. If you switch back to it after getting caught, you'll have to wait for it to leave before you start hunting for remotes again. INPUT6 wants to keep you disoriented and distracted. As if a non-Euclidean geometric nightmare of a factory and the Mayday weren't enough, you're also under constant threat of the most terrifying thing imaginable: technical issues. Every so often the input will glitch out, and you'll be forced to play through a mini-game on the fly to fix it, or risk a nasty penalty. They're nothing too hard, just simple 3-beat rhythms, memory puzzles, keep the small thing in the big thing. I don't really know what you'd call this one, sorts of mini-games. But layered on top of everything else the game throws at you, they can be infuriating. I was especially bad at this one. Each missed click costs you a life, and I was almost never able to hit the mouse button on the beat. The cost of losing them is steep too. Losing colour or distorting the screen makes it hard to pick out the tiny remotes from the environment. The sound breaking down makes it a lot harder to sense when Mayday is nearby, and those aren't even the worst options. It's hard enough to pick out the remotes as it is. You can't afford to have your senses messed with any more than they already are. Speaking of the remotes, their positions are randomised each game, and each input can drop them pretty much anywhere. Sometimes they can spawn right next to the starting room. Others you'll have to trek across the entire factory to find. They do glow green from afar and gold if you get up close, but don't expect them to stand out from a distance, especially if they're in an already busy room. The best way I found to pick them out was to learn the general layout of each room and then search for changes. It was a lot easier to notice something that shouldn't be there than to go combing the factory for something that potentially could be anywhere. The disorientation does lessen over time as you collect more remotes, since each one will remove that specific input for the run, but you'll never be free of the game's ticking clock. The 15-minute time limit doesn't seem like much, but it's usually just enough to keep things tense without being too strict. Though ironically, after a streak of successful runs off camera, the first round I recorded for this video ended with a timeout. Oops. You do have a run option if you'd rather fast forward past each empty hallway, but it makes it that much easier for Mayday to catch you unawares. I generally don't like time limit mechanics, but I think it works here because the game is so short overall anyway. I've not had as much time to sit down and relax with a good game for hours on end in a while, so in recent months I've found a new affinity for titles you can pick up and play in short bursts, and INPUT6 might be the shortest I've found to still leave me satisfied. Indeed, I bet you could probably beat the game twice in the time it'll take you to finish watching this video. For such a short game, it does a great job of keeping its map layout obscured, so that even after 4 hours of playtime, the place still feels pretty fresh despite its small size. If you're not looking for a bite-sized stress fest, there are a bunch of difficulty options to mix and match depending on what you want out of the game, including a Mayday-free exploration mode if you just want to know where the hell everything is. Once you get comfortable with classic mode, I'd definitely suggest giving challenge mode a go too. Not only does it make Mayday and the mini-games extra aggressive, it lowers the time limit from 15 minutes to 5. It's brutal, but apparently you do get a cool bonus for completing it. I don't know for certain though, because I've never been able to beat it, is what I would say, but again, ironically, I did actually finish the game on challenge mode while recording the video, with seconds to spare too. I found the final remote in the very last place I chose chose to look in Input 2, but well before that, the game basically handed me the first couple early on, and you can see the panic rising in my playstyle as I realise, holy shit, I actually have a shot at beating this. It was a great tense moment, one of many that Input 6 was able to offer. I've spoken in other videos about how most horror media doesn't really scare me anymore. Not because I'm built different or anything like that, but because it's my favourite genre and I'm just desensitized to it after so long. But Input 6 got to me, instantly, which is the whole reason why I wanted to talk about it. I've played games that have got under my skin for the channel before, but Input 6 is the first that got to me enough that I had to stop playing for the night and come back to it later. I think part of that is because I was very tired when I first started playing, and was overwhelmed by all the mechanics, simple though they are, but it's also because Input 6 just ticks all the right boxes for me. As I said, I hate time limit mechanics in games. They stress me out, and if you put them beside the liminal space of a factory and throw in an angry robot, that's apparently enough to scare me. I don't really know why I'm surprised. The other two games I've covered on the channel that genuinely creeped me out, Alyssa and, of all titles, Five Nights at Freddy's, also feature once friendly robots twisted into Uncanny Valley nightmare fuel in weird Uncanny Valley locations. So Input 6 was basically guaranteed to scare me, at least a little. Now that I've finished the game multiple times and seen everything it has to offer, it doesn't scare me anymore. Familiarity with any horror media will do that, but I think it's still impressive that it was able to affect me so much, so quickly. I think that comes down to how good a job Input 6 does at keeping Mayday out of sight. You can download a couple of crisp, clean renders of Mayday off Goostronaut's website, and out of context, without any of the visual distortion, it's just the right balance between scary and sexy. Look at that pose, that smirk. Who wouldn't want to be chased down a dark corridor by that? It's a really clever design, especially if you get into the weeds of how the Maydays work in Input 6's collectible documents. But in general gameplay, the Mayday is only ever a threat. You rarely see it move, but you feel its speed and strength in the poses it strikes, and the sounds it makes when it chooses to be seen or heard. It's like a spider sitting on a wall. The potential of what it could do is way worse than anything it probably will do. And, indeed, if you actually do fail to switch inputs in time, the obligatory jump scares are actually pretty tame for the genre. Mayday is at its most creepy from a distance, where you can't quite make out its features through the analogue fuzz, where the most striking thing about it is its glowing red eyes. These cutaways you're forced to watch after you're caught are way creepier than any of the actual jump scares. The Mayday's movements are appropriately stiff and robotic, but also troubled. Something's clearly not right with it, and that gives it the appearance of unpredictability, even if, mechanically, you can learn how it works quite easily. Mayday might be the main attraction of the game, but the TechAid facility has a lot of personality even without the robot. It's got a very muted look to most of its rooms. They're all the whites and greys and browns you'd expect to find in a factory setting, though things can get a little more colourful in certain areas like the offices and the printing press. The lighting is largely flat as well, though that's mostly to make the Mayday and the remotes you're searching for pop out from the environment. Pretty much every room is filled with believable levels of clutter to draw your eye away from the remotes you're searching for, and better yet, each area has a clear and obvious purpose. This is where they assembled the heads. This is where the staff went to eat lunch. This is their big scary security office. You're never told much about the factory, but the level design and the set dressing are so good that you can infer everything you need to know about any given room you find just by taking a look around to see what's there. The visuals do a great job of recreating the low fidelity of analog machines too, right down to the slight warping at the edges of the screen when you're perusing the documents you can find around the factory. I do wish there was an option to turn these effects off completely. The most you can do is remove them from the menus. I guess to make reading the minigames and collectibles easier, but that's as far as you can go in the settings menu itself. It does at least mean the transitions between active gameplay and the pre-rendered cinematics are smooth as butter though. God damn, you can barely tell the difference. The sound design is no less authentic, though it's a lot more subtle. The prerequisite clicks and whirs and bleeps and bloops of ancient machinery are almost constant, especially if you're hit with a lot of mini-games at once. The whine of the tape being fast-forwarded was so vivid, it made me feel like I was being activated as a sleeper agent for something. The crackle and whoosh whenever Mayday's nearby was a nice touch too, but beyond that, and aside from your own footsteps, there isn't actually that much sound design to be found. Very occasionally you might hear the ticking of a clock, or the beeping of whatever this is. I wouldn't worry about it, probably not important. But that's pretty much it. There's even less to hear on input 2, which, due to a damaged microphone, emits audio that's little more than a muffled roar. There's certainly no music, just the distant drone of the factory as you wander its empty halls. Horror games live and die by the quality of their sound design, and for a one-person operation, I think INPUT6 does a great job, and I think it's a big reason why it was able to get under my skin so well the first time I played it. But unfortunately, the one place where it falls short is the monster. The main reason the jump scares are so milquetoast is that the accompanying sound effects just aren't that effective. I was way more freaked out by the sound of Mayday running up behind me the first time I played than by any actual jump scare. In fact, I chickened out before I was ever caught simply because the threat of a jump scare was way more effective than the moment itself ultimately turned out to be. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the audio is the voice acting. As a one-person developer, Goostronaut had access to Goostronaut, and that's probably it. But despite that rather glaring limitation, there's more voice acting in the game than you might expect. There are at least 5 speaking roles, though all but one are so heavily processed they're basically impossible to understand without subtitles.
It is here, in this factory, where every single day the acclaimed personal robotic assistants Mayday are created. And what does this process look like, you may ask? Well, let's take a glimpse and see how a groundbreaking invention is made.
The end result makes for some wonderfully creepy performances that fit right into the analog horror aesthetic. Overall, the sound design sticks to the old adage of less is more, and given how loud and in your face a lot of horror games can be with their audio, that's definitely not a bad thing. It's actually pretty refreshing. Which brings me to the story. The simple truth of horror is that the more you learn about the monster, the less scary it becomes. And in INPUT6, you can learn a lot about the Mayday stalking you through the Techade factory. The game is filled with little hidden collectibles to find that range from a Mayday manual to a newspaper reporting on the reveal of the robot at a tech show, to a pile of insurance claims. Like the remotes, they're not easy to find unless you're right on top of them, but to offset their camouflage, they never actually move between runs either. What's clever is that while the collectibles do provide satisfying answers, they often also raise more questions the way any good mystery box story should. Indeed, the mystery of what's going on is baked into the game's very premise. You're not playing as some digital ghost that can switch between camera feeds at will. You're a freelance investigator hired to figure out just what exactly happened to the Techade factory after it befell some disaster on the 18th of April 1994. You're not fighting for your life, you're fighting the VHS player while trying to review several tapes for evidence. And the more collectibles you find, the more things start to make sense. For example, reading through the Mayday manual reveals that the tapes you're playing through are actually recordings made by other Mayday models. That's why you just respawn back at the starting point of each area after getting caught by the big girl, and also why the Mayday hunting you seems so much taller. The camera you're seeing through is actually located at the base of the robot's neck, rather than at eye level. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. If you want to learn all of Techade's dirty secrets, go to here. I'm going to choose to ignore that. Reading the Mayday manual also drops the bombshell that the one hunting you isn't actually malfunctioning. In a market oversaturated with supernatural forces possessing otherwise neutral robots, the fact that the Mayday is working as intended is honestly quite refreshing. The bright red eyes simply mean it's been set to alert mode, and for good reason. The remotes you're searching for are to set off the explosives wired up all over the factory. You lose access to that input the second you find each remote, because the job of that particular Mayday is done. There's nothing the big girl can really do to stop it at that point. If you find all 5 remotes, you're then switched over to the 6th input to settle the matter for good. The ending twist of Input 6 is that the monster was actually the protagonist all along. You were the villain trying to cause great harm from the very beginning. The conspiracy goes even deeper if you manage to find all the collectibles and get the secret hidden ending, but I'll leave that up to you to discover yourself. What impressed me so much about the whole scenario isn't the bait and switch of your role in the story because, let's be honest, the indie horror game protagonist turning out to have been the villain all along is a well-trod path by this point. It's that the answers to the game's mysteries are so strikingly mundane. There's nothing explicitly supernatural going on. Everything bad that happens can be traced back to bad decisions based on human greed. Pure and simple. That's why I found Input 6 to be such a breath of fresh air, though that's not to say its answers are all so concrete and final. There are definitely some questions left open for interpretation, or a potential follow-up. The Mayday might be following orders, but if you watch the cinematics after getting caught, you'll see it's got some issues of its own to work out too. The way it degrades physically over time makes it clear that something's wrong with it, but you're never given a definite answer on what it might be, or if you do, it went right over my head. My best guess is that it's conflicted over its instructions. Indeed, it could be that it's starting to become self-aware, but if so, it doesn't get much of a chance to express it. There's also the fact you can sometimes switch to an input 0. It's very rare, and I have no idea what it means because I never stuck around long enough to check, but I love the questions it raises. Ultimately though, it doesn't need an answer because Input 6 already has the technique to stick a satisfying landing. The Mayday was just doing its job, and the Tech Aid factory was blown up with mountains of explosives unwittingly activated by the player's hand. And that's more than enough for me, but it's fun to speculate that there might be something beyond that too. Something left unexplained for future entries to explore, or to simply spur discussion among invested fans. Ultimately, I hope Input 6 does get some sort of follow-up, but even if it doesn't, it's still a great example of a short-form horror game that puts a new spin on an old formula. So much horror media these days wrap up their scares in layers of complexity, but in my experience, it's always the simplest things that turn out the most frightening, and Input 6 understands that implicitly. It doesn't reinvent the genre, it probably won't blow you away, but it might still surprise you with what it has to offer. Hell, it surprised me. It was the most scared I've been by a video game in a while. If you're a fan of analog horror looking for something bite-sized, I can't think of anything better to play in the post-Halloween period, because as they say, it's always Halloween somewhere. I don't know how to end this video, can you tell? Ah! And that's the video. Before I go, I'd like to thank by name the people supporting the channel with $5 US a month or more on Patreon. Azazel, Hawkwing2652, Hey Matey, Rowbely, Sarah Bloomer, Sneezy McGlassface, This Sauerkraut, and Zeke the Phantom. Thank you so much. To everyone else, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. For Trespasser, I swear, it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. I'm gonna do it. The video's coming out. It's gonna come out. It's gonna! But Input 6 is the first that... Just flicked a fucking hair into my eye. What the hell?